Good evening. I should say hello again because I'm taping this in the evening, but you all may be watching it anytime. It's a pleasure to be back. We're doing the fourth segment on Exodus, and I call this the struggling to the covenant. And we had looked at a variety of. I had suggested, not real clearly, but suggested a variety of readings between then and now. And if you look at the chapters, you'll see how chopped up Exodus is. You'll have a couple chapters of history, then you'll have 3 or 4 chapters of ritual and how you build an altar and how you do this festival and how you treat your slaves and blah, blah, blah. And then you'll have another 3 or 4 chapters of history. This is what we've talked about since the beginning about how these books were all brought together from multiple sources in about 500 BC when they were in the Babylonian exile. So that's why the chop up, and that's why we'll jump around large sections, because a lot of the detail about how you do this ritual and how you do that and how you build your altar doesn't mean anything to us at this point. So when you read, I had you all skim chapters 21, and I went on skim 22 and 23, just as an example of some of these laws, and you read them and you'll see these are not laws that are relevant for a 5 or 10,000 person nomadic group that's gotten to Mount Sinai and South Central Sinai. All these laws are basically an agricultural society. How long you keep a slave, what you do with this, what you do with that, what happens if your ox scores somebody, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an interesting to look at, but it's totally unrelated to the era in where Moses is alive and working on the covenant with God. And there's some interesting ones stuck in there. Part of it is to control, you'll find a variety of laws and rules to control blood feuds. And this is important in a tribal society because blood feuds have been with humans since the beginning of humanity. And basically is if you're in this clan or family or part of a tribe and someone in the other tribe kills your brother, even if your brother was a jerk and had it coming to him, you are obligated to go kill that person in revenge. And then that person's brother is going to try to kill you. And blah, 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 off and on. You go on into these feuds, which can be devastating as people are killing each other just out of revenge for what you're doing. I touched the thing there, Eric. Am I still focused?
Yep, you're good.
I just had a little technical problem here from my clumsy foot. And you've had these types of feuds in modern times. You had the mafia wars called the Five Families Wars in New York after World War II. You had the Hatfield and McCoy feud down in West Virginia where I was from. And those more modern feuds, not only do you have the blood feud, but it ends up in a feud over money, because that's what the Hatfields, as they won, began to monopolize the coal trade and the lumber business in southern West Virginia. So, in the end, the great love of money bugaboo asserts its head even in these blood feuds. But in the tribal societies, controlling the blood feuds was crucial. You had to have a way of stopping them, or they just go on forever. So they later developed places of refuge. First, where you could go to the sanctuary and they couldn't kill you there. And then they developed cities of refuge later, where if you got into that city and stayed there for a year, it would clean your sin. Medieval Europe had this cities of refuge, also various rules like that to control the blood feuds. And that's really a good thing. And then you have probably the most misquoted part of the Old Testament, which is eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And I've heard people use that to justify exacting revenge. And that's not what it says. If you go back and read it, it says a life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. What it really is restricting revenge. That if someone cost you your eye, it's fair enough to cost him his eye, but you can't kill him because they didn't kill you. So it's really, I've heard people use this for justification for revenge. That's not what it says. And this is important to read these things in the entirety in the proper context. It is to restrict revenge, to keep this evil thing of human nature under control, which is the desire for revenge. A couple other ones, interesting ones, are tucked away in 22 and 23 chapters. One of them is you can't loan money and interest. That's interesting because that really has erratic enforcement, is what I have in my notes. By the time of Jesus, which is about 1,200 years later, clearly were banking communities, because if you remember the stories about the rich man giving his various servants 10 talents or 5 talents or 1 talent, or in some stories it's 5 and 2 and 1, to take with what to manage while he's away. And the guy who got the least, just buried it. And he says, well, at least you could have given it, deposited it with the bankers, then I would have gotten interest. So by Jesus' time, this prohibition against loaning money at interest has disappeared. And because you have to be able to loan money at interest to have a banking society to allow your culture to grow economically. But this persisted even until the Middle Ages, that in the Western Christianity adopted is a better term, adopted this because they read it strictly. And the problem with that, of course, is that it stifles your business. So what happens in Europe? The Jews become the money lenders. They're not Christians. They're not held to Christian law. So they become the money lenders. And in certain societies, it made some of them very rich. The Rothschilds were the bankers of France and Germany, became extremely rich. So you have to be careful with these rules that you don't maneuver them around in a way that doesn't make sense. One of them is don't cheat the poor. That's in chapter 23, verse 6. I thought, boy, that's good advice. I wish people would do that now, not cheat the poor. Then they have one of them that's in there twice. It's in here, and then it's in the 30s when we finish up. You cannot boil a small goat, in its mother's milk. And this is a good example about how you can overinterpret the law, because the Jewish education and scholarly work is very, very complicated, very intricate. There are people for centuries in Judaism who basically spend their whole lives reading the law and writing long text about exactly what it means. This is a very simple reference to a Canaanite fertility cult, which is that they would take a newborn lamb and boil it in the mother's milk, and that was a Canaanite fertility ritual. So the prohibition is saying don't adopt the Canaanite fertility rituals, and this is one of them. This has been so overinterpreted that we had a person in our class for years who's now moved out of town, became a good friend, who grew up in a conservative Jewish family, and they had the two sets of dishes because they interpreted it so strictly that you couldn't merge meat and dairy under any circumstances. And that's not what this says. It's not what it's about. It's simply you can't do this Canaanite religious festival. So she said in class, you mean we had the two sets of dishes simply because this was a prohibition against the Canaanite fertility festival? I said, yeah. And so that's a good example of torturing the scriptures, of becoming so technical and so precise and so over-interpreting them that you lose the real meaning. The real meaning is when we move to Canaan, you're going to have all this temptation to get involved with the fertility cults, the ancient religions of the land there, and you got to have forbearance and not do it. And that's what it was about, not whether you actually have mixed meat and dairy. So it's a very interesting example on how you don't over-interpret the scriptures. It's a fascinating story. In chapter 24, you have a section from the priestly writings, and this is kind of classic for the priestly writings. It's much more organized. It's much more bureaucratic. You have Moses and a few other people and all these 70 leaders that go up on the mountain to start have contact with God. And you find that in the priestly writings, they emphasize the importance of the hereditary priesthood to which they're part, as it makes their own role more important. But it's different than all the other accounts here. And then Moses goes up the mountain, then the cloud comes down, and this is where the covenant is enacted. Now, covenants are a term from the ancient Middle East, and it's not a term that we use now. And there were two forms of covenants in the old days. A certain form, a covenant between equal, we have in modern life without any kind of term of covenant. We have had peace treaties or uh, weapons treaties with the old Soviet Union. We're each coming at it as on a parity basis, each being equal nuclear powers. We won't develop any more launching things than this, and they won't develop anything's fine, and that saves everybody a lot of trouble and a lot of money, et cetera, et cetera. You have other covenants. You have a marriage covenant. We're going to share everything. We're going to be faithful, et cetera, and that's a covenant. Now, those are between equals. The covenant here with God is called a suzerainty covenant. It's a person who is superior, clearly superior, more powerful, giving a covenant to a subordinate. This is God to the Hebrew people. Clearly a difference in power and subordination. And this is a gift. And the covenant has certain things. It's very simple in its simple context. I will be your God. You only have one God. And you will be my people. You will be first among the world, and I will take care of you and put you in the Holy Land, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a particular type of covenant. And this is the beginning of it at Sinai. And so they had this in chapter 24, this complicated ritual of the priesthood going up there, et cetera. Moses makes this and is going to come down, and the cloud comes down, and he meets with God for 6 days, and then everybody else goes down, but Moses is up there, they say, for 40 days and 40 nights, which simply means a long time. That's 40 days and 40 nights, or 40 years to 40 months. It's simply a long time. And then it stops, and you have a bunch of the other stuff about ritual in between, and it starts again in chapter 32, which is the more famous one. And this is back, not the priestly account, but the old epic, the ones that were told around the campfires orally for centuries. And this is the golden calf story. The people get antsy and jumpy as Moses is up on the mountain a long time. They think maybe he's abandoned them, so they go to Aaron and say, make us a god. And so Aaron gathers up all the gold jewelry in the camp. It's interesting for slaves to have a lot of gold jewelry, melts it down, and makes a golden calf. Now, it's probably relatively small, but it's a graven image. And they worship it, and they dance around, and they're having this festival. And God talks to Moses. God says, hey, they're doing this. I'm going to destroy them. Moses talks him out of it. It's very interesting. It's a fascinatingly different approach to God than we have now. I would never try to talk God out of something or argue with him, etc. But the God in the Old Testament is much angrier than the God that we see, that we worship now. The human God hasn't changed, but the human understanding has. And God in the Old Testament had more human characteristics than he does now, where he's a God of love and generosity and support rather than anger and vengeance minded. And so anyway, God warns Moses, and Moses talks him out of destroying everybody. So Moses goes down, and they're having this festival around this calf, and he takes the tablets that he's got and smashes them, and starts to punish them. He breaks down the golden calf and melts it and casts it among the water, the remnants of it, and makes them drink it, which is a form of really making them subordinate and punishing them. And so, and that's kind of trying to purge them of this. But what this really is this is the opening salvo in a 700-year war between the faith of Yahweh, the Lord, the faith in the Lord, and the fertility cults that were rampant in the Middle East at the time. The bull was the representative of Baal, the male fertility god. He was the storm god. He was a god of virility and power, and the bull is powerful and can gore people and muscular, and that macho virility of manhood. And it's not an image with which we're unfamiliar, because if you're familiar with Merrill Lynch, what's their symbol? Merrill Lynch's symbol is a bull. Okay, and if I've never been outside Wall Street, but there's a famous statue out there of a bull. So it's a natural image we've held on, but this was the male godhead of the Middle East, not the Zeus god of the Greek gods, which was different but similar. And there was a female one called Ashtar or Asherah, and she was the god of fertility. So she often was portrayed with large breasts, with a pregnant abdomen, suckling a child, etc. And she was of fertility. And so the fertility cults were easy because they didn't demand a lot of behavioral change from you. They enhanced sexuality, they worshiped sexuality, and they had sacred prostitutes and all this. And they were very, very corrupting. But this is the 700-year war that goes on because as the Hebrews move into Palestine, and they don't wipe out all the local people, they overrule them, take over, but they don't wipe them out. And these were all part of the farming rituals. If you're going to do plants, you plant your crops at this time, and you say your sacrifices to Baal and dance around the fertility pole that Ashtoreth has to get your crops. So it's very easy to get corrupted with this. And then if you have your sons marry the local women, they bring their graven images into the house, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a 700-year war, and this goes on. And it's a constant struggle as we go through Samuel and Kings. We'll see this struggle. A lot of these kings, even though they had the fancy temple built by Solomon, they brought in idols of these gods and put them inside the temple into the sacred place of the Yahweh faith. So it's a long battle, and the Babylonian exile clears it out. That what they found archaeologically is if you dig up the Hebrew houses between the conquest, about 1100, and the Babylonian exile, about 590, you do find these small household figurine gods inside the houses that they dig up. When they come back from the Babylonian exile, you don't. So the Babylonian exile purged the faith of all this corruption, allowed them to develop the scriptures, allowed them to understand the coming of the Messiah, and it was a very painful but very curative thing. So this is a 700-year war. It's going to go on, and we'll read about it again and again. So that's what this is about. So part of the interesting part of this is the approach between Moses and God. Can he talk him out of this, and he'd smash the tablets, et cetera, et cetera. And so Moses eventually decides to go back up to meet with God again, and God says, you can't do this. You got to take this under control, smash the idols, no more of this fertility stuff. Cut down the sacred poles when you get there, because those are the Ashtar's sacred poles, fertility. And then God tells them, all right, get ready. We're going to move on now. We're not going to stay down here in Sinai out of the way. We're going to get moving, and we're going to go conquer the Holy Land, which now became the Holy Land, the land of milk and honey. So they start to move. Now remember, these people probably only walked about 15 miles a day. You got to get up in the morning, and you got to pack up your tents and your cooking equipment, and you gather your livestock, and you got to walk, have lunch, then you got to settle down, make your camp again, and that. So you can't go that far when you're moving these thousands of people. Along the way, they create the tent of the meeting. This is where Moses would go out in a tent, and he'd meet, and God, who's in the cloud, would come and meet with Moses. And if you needed Moses' help or judgment or God's help, then you could come and talk to Moses. You couldn't go in the tent. Only Moses could go in the tent. But this sets up the process for making the pilgrimage into Canaan. And there's a final time that Moses goes back up the mountain. He smashed the tablets. He's going to have to get another set. So he has another conversation with God. He's up there a long time again. So there's a discussion about you can't see God. That if you see God's face, it will kill you. Moses says, okay. And he says, but I'm going to let you see my back. So he puts him in a cleft in the rock, and God holds his hand over the cleft and hides Moses' vision of him. And he takes his hand away, and Moses can see God's back. It's a fascinating story. I'm not certain what the point of it is. It clearly shows how primitive the understanding of the divine was at that time, that the divine had to have a back and a face and hand and other physical type. We don't think that of the divine at all. That God is a presence, but he doesn't have a physical body that we have to worry about. So it's a fascinating story, it really is. And it's very difficult to understand it exactly, but it gives an inkling as to, as to how the understanding of the divine has changed over these centuries, as everything else has too. So he gets another 2 tablets, and God's make Moses sits down, and they work out some of the details of the covenant. And again, is that covenant of superiority to a subservient person. And God says, we're going to conquer. I'm going to lead you on to success, and we'll be able to conquer the local tribes that he names them all, the Canaanites and the Pizzites, and I can't remember all. And we'll drive them all out. But you got to do certain things. You got to cut down their sacred poles. This is the battle with the fertility cults coming up again. You got to be careful about the foreign wives for your sons. Those are going to corrupt you because they'll bring their own images and all their religion with them. You can't have graven images, period, end of discussion. They ended up with graven images, but this is what the battle is. You have to continue the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay, you can do that. It continues the firstborn of any group, including humans or animals, is dedicated to God. I'm not certain exactly what this means, because even the firstborn sons are supposed to be dedicated to God, but it's unclear what this means. Continue to have the regular festivals. Again, talked about the unleavened bread. You must maintain the Feast of the Passover. This gets forgotten for several centuries. Again, can't boil the kid in its mother's milk. Keep the Sabbath with these very strict rules about the Sabbath. It not only applies to you, it applies to everybody in your household. It applies to your servants. It applies to any visitors you've got, even though if they're not Jewish. They have to adhere to this. So Moses is back up on the mountain again for another 40 days, which just means a long time. And when he comes down from the mountain, his face is radiant in such a way that people can't healthily look at him. It's because he's had such an exposure to God on a personal level that his face is radiant and a glow. So they arrange a veil for him. So when he's out with the Hebrew people, he wears a veil. When he goes into the tent of the meeting to meet with God, he takes off the veil to meet with God. Like I said, this was not going to be as much fun as the last 2 lessons, which are more fun, but this is important to understand. And a couple things to take away from here, that these are difficult people. God is faithful to them and makes a deal with them that they tend to break all the time. The deals are relatively simple. I will be your God and you will be my people. But this is the beginning of the 700-year war with the fertility cults, with Baal, with Ashtar, all the other things that come with it. A 700-year war that God eventually wins by sending them off to exile in Babylon. Has to continue to punish them to the end. Now we'll be back in a week. One of my regular participants pointed out I should be more clear in the recommended reading assignment. This is not a requirement. If you don't want to do the reading, that's fine. I'll do the reading and I'll be happy to discuss it. But if you want to read it in advance, then the reading would be Exodus chapter 37, just the first 9 verses. And then you'll jump all the way to Numbers. You go past Leviticus. We're not going to read Leviticus. It's all the details of the intricacies of the law. We're not going to go there. So you go to Numbers and you read chapters 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. 9 through 14 chapters in Numbers. This is the beginning of the movement up toward the Canaan land to get them ready to make the attack. They settle into an area and stay up there. So Exodus 37, verses 1 through 9. Then Numbers, chapters 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. That's the recommended reading. And if you don't want to read it, that's fine. I'll be back in a week and we can discuss this again. This is Dr. Robert Guthrie. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.